and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Entertainment Network. I am your host, Sarah. It's Tuesday, and I'm delighted to be with you this week on the correct day to bring you another author interview. As we get started, I want to remind you, as I always do, to please like, follow, and subscribe on whatever platform you are either listening to or watching this episode on. Really does help that algorithm. If you want to support the podcast and the network as a whole in a monetary fashion, you can do so by going to gsmcpodcast.info. There you can leave a tip or a donation. When you're there, you can also leave a question or a comment. I love hearing from you, so if you have anything that you would like to know or talk about, you can do that also at gsmcpodcast.info. I'm happy to engage with those as soon as I can after receiving them. Again, if you want to leave a tip or a donation and help out the podcast in a monetary fashion, you can do so by going to gsmcpodcast.info. As always, whatever support you give, no matter the form that support takes, is always greatly appreciated. Welcome to this week's author interview. I hope you are having a good week so far. It is Carnival here. Kind of like Mardi Gras in the US. It's that period of time leading up to the season of Lent. Tomorrow is Ash Wednesday, so normally we would have gone to the Carnival parade down in our village, but today we unfortunately did not get to go. I'm a little disappointed, but these things happen. Just had something else scheduled meeting-wise at the same time, so a little bummed out about that. Was looking forward to it. It's the tiniest, cutest little parade you've ever seen, and it's always fun, but these things happen, and so we didn't go, but there's always next year. Had a good weekend. We went to a birthday party on Saturday. My friend Michelle is a big cosplayer. She loves to cosplay, and she loves theme parties. So she throws herself theme parties. This year her birthday is really close to Valentine's Day, and it's difficult to schedule at the same time as Valentine's Day, and so she scheduled it for March 1st, and so the theme was Mad Hatter, and it was a very merry unbirthday. It was an unbirthday party. She made her own outfit as the Mad Hatter. It was very impressive. She looked great. People were encouraged to dress up. Some people did. I did not. I had a couple of vague ideas, but I'm not great at creating my own costumes. I don't fully know where to even start going about buying. It is Carnival here, which is a little bit like Halloween in the US in that there's all the what we would think of as Halloween costumes are out right now for little kids because little kids dress up for Carnival, which is kind of cool. So I guess I probably could have found something, but my brain just wasn't braining in the right way. So we didn't dress up. We dressed up. My husband and I dressed up. We looked nice. We were dressed for a party, just not dressed in theme, but we weren't the only ones, so we didn't stand out or anything. And it was fun to see the other attendees and what they wore. Her grandparents were there. Her grandfather's in his 90s, and they were super cute. She made them dress up. Well, she made them wear hats since it was a Mad Hatter tea party. They were very cute. But anyway, that was part of our weekend, and it was a lot of fun. But you are here for an author interview to learn, maybe about a new book to you, or maybe a book that you have already been familiar with but wanting to know more of. This week, I am talking to Joanne Howard about her historical fiction novel, Sleeping in the Sun. Let me give you the description. In the last years of the British Raj, an American missionary family stays on in Midnapore, India. Though the Hintons enjoy white privileges, they have never been accepted by British society and instead run a boarding house on the outskirts of town where wayward native Indians come to find relief. Young Gene Hinton can't get out from under the thumb of his 3 older brothers, and the only person he can really relate to is Arthur, his family's Indian servant. But when Uncle Ellis, a high-ranking British judge, suddenly arrives and announces he'll be staying indefinitely in their humble house, far from his prestigious post in the Himalayan foothills, life as Gene knows it is interrupted. While his brothers are excited at the judge's arrival, he is skeptical as to why this important man is hiding out with them in the backwaters of Bengal. Also skeptical is Arthur. Then an Indian woman appears on their doorstep, and after growing close to her, Arthur learns the sinister truth about the judge. Torn between a family that has provided him shelter, work, and purpose his whole life, and the escalating outrage of his countrymen, Arthur must decide where his loyalties lie, and the Hintons must decide if they can still call India home. Again, that's the description of Sleeping in the Sun. It is historical fiction. You get a sense of that time period. It's not right when the uprising is happening, when India is gaining their independence from Britain. It's kind of the events, the years leading up to that. And it's not years. This takes place over a couple of months in the summer when the boys are home from their boarding school. It takes place in a very compact space of time. Joanne talks about that a little bit. And you get this really interesting view of India at the time. Often when we think of, this time period, you would think, of course, of British, of Indians, etc., and the conflict that was happening. India was a colony. They gained their independence, but not without a lot of hardship and strife to get there. But the Hintons are an American family, and you don't often think of American missionaries in India at this time. Often you think of British families, right? So they are outsiders in a way, in a lot of ways, but they're outsiders. They're neither Indian nor British, so there's that. And then there's just a lot of layers going on here. And then we get the perspective of Arthur, who has been with the family for a couple of decades, and he is trying to figure out a lot of things. He's starting to question things at the beginning, and then he meets the woman who brings different perspectives to a lot of other issues. Another friend of his asks him a question. There's just a lot going on, especially around identity and what it means to be an outsider in this society. I don't know if you can hear the whiny little puppy. He wants to be in the bedroom. It's probably time for bed. I'll be putting him to bed here soon. But if you are a fan of historical fiction, and this might not be a time period or a place and events that you are terribly familiar with, or maybe you are and you want to read a book that is set there, then definitely I hope you enjoy this conversation. Again, the book is called Sleeping in the Sun. The author is Joanne Howard. Hi, Joanne, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Happy to be
Thank,
here.
thank you for being here. I'm excited to talk about it's your debut novel, correct?
It is, yeah, my first book. Yeah,
That's very
have it right
exciting.
here. Sleeping in the Sun.
Sleeping in the Sun, perfect. Before we do that, though, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself, taking a few minutes so my listeners can get to know you a bit.
Sure, yep. So I'm Joanne Howard, the author of Sleeping in the Sun, my debut historical novel. I am a Bay Area native in California, and I work professionally as a copywriter. So I am writing all day, every day. And I wrote this novel. It started as my thesis when was earning my master's degree in creative writing at Pacific University in Oregon. And I just was writing this as I was also working professionally. So I would write at around like 4 a.m. or after work or even on my lunch breaks, just little pockets of time. And somehow wrote a novel over the years, and here it is. So yeah, my first novel. And I'm just so excited to finally share it. It's published through She Writes Press, a hybrid press that is also located here in the Bay Area. And this novel is very personal to me. It's inspired by my grandpa's childhood in India as an American boy. And I just never really have seen any novels about Americans in India during that time. Plenty of British novels about that. But I just thought this kind of third perspective of Americans in India was an interesting angle to kind of explore. So, yeah, happy to chat with you about it.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned getting up at 4 to write. Are you a morning
Yeah.
person, or was that by necessity? Because I'm trying to think of myself forming coherent sentences at 4 in the morning.
Oh, yeah. No, exactly. It's a little bit of both. Yeah, I'm definitely a morning person. 4 a.m. is very extreme still, though. But for me, it was just a question of like, what is the most reliable time that I will write? Whereas, like, if I left it for later in the day after work, then like so many other factors could, affect whether or not I actually sit down and do it. I could just be like, I had a long day at work. I have to do something at home or something. So it might not happen. Whereas if I if I made it 4 a.m. every day, like I was definitely going to do it, even though I totally agree. Sometimes my brain was like not the most functioning at that time. But
Yeah.
that was mostly like for the drafting phase where I wasn't looking for perfection anyway. The point was just to get the words on the page so that I could have something to form and to shape like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes sense. So you've given a brief overview, but can you give a more extensive overview of the story?
Sure. So, Sleeping in the Sun is a historical novel. It follows a young American boy named Gene Hinton, who is the youngest of a family of American missionaries who have stayed in India for decades, actually. And they are operating a boarding house where Indians and white people of anyone who needs a place to stay, they come and go in this like very large house, which is actually a former British officer's house. It's kind of this old white concrete building that's a bit cold, but anyway. Um, and the kind of inciting action is that the family friend named Judge Ellis, who is a high-ranking British judge, comes to visit and to stay with them indefinitely. And the family kind of thinks it's a bit strange because he is, this wealthy, powerful man, and they are a pretty poor rural family of missionaries in this smaller town outside of Calcutta. And so the youngest boy, Gene, kind of takes it upon himself to figure out what's going on with the judge. Why is he kind of being a bit cagey? He's not his usual friendly, outgoing self that Gene's older brothers remember from the last time the judge visited.
So you heard a little bit about Gene as one of the main characters, Arthur being the other point of view that we get in this book. Both actually are really good contrast, or I should back up and say Judge Ellis is actually a really good contrast for both of them from their points of view, because he comes into their life and that is the inciting factor for everything that they start trying to figure out, realizing that they maybe are, it's kind of coming of age for both of them in some ways. Gene is 12, Arthur is decades older, but they really are both experiencing a lot of change, a lot of realizations, a lot of kind of those coming of age themes throughout the book, and Judge Ellis really is the inciting factor for that. We're going to take our first break of this episode. When we come back, we'll talk about Arthur as the other main character and point of view. You are tuned in to the GSMC Book Review podcast, and I'll be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review podcast and my conversation with Joanne Howard. Just your second reminder, as I have it up next to me, that you can support the podcast and the network as a whole in a monetary fashion by going to gsmcpodcast.info. You can leave a tip or a donation. Again, that is gsmcpodcast.info. And once again, all support, no matter what form that support comes in, is always greatly appreciated. For the break, Joanne was talking about Gene as one of the main characters and points of view in this story, and now she's going to be moving on to Arthur as the other main character and point of view within the book.
And then also who's kind of on his own journey of discovery is Arthur, who is the family's only Indian servant. And he is kind of at a point in his life where he is questioning, has it all been worth serving this family for his whole life, basically, when he doesn't really have anything to show for it himself. He doesn't have his own place, his own family. And he through a friend who asks him this, he wonders, does the family even care about him at all? And so it's kind of a questioning of Arthur's loyalties. And then, of course, this is all set against the backdrop of the political climate at the time, which is it's still a decade before official independence in India, but there are definitely rumblings of, political discontent, and Arthur kind of has to choose between serving this white foreign family versus, aligning with his countrymen who are very fiercely calling for independence.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, and you never give the specific year for the story. Was that deliberate? Did you want to make sure, you wanted to have the general time frame, but
yeah,
not that specific year?
yeah, the general time frame was the important thing for me because I think I wanted to keep the scope like pretty tight in terms of the family, and it takes place in one season too, so it's not tracking to a specific historical event that's happening in real life. So yeah, I didn't want the history to be, too at the forefront of the story. I wanted to be about the characters themselves. And in my opinion, I think like the best stories can kind of be taken from any place in time and put in another place in time and still make sense in terms of what the characters are going through from a human perspective. So that's kind of what I was trying to do here. So I just wanted the historical climate to inform the story, but not have the story be, kind of like this historical textbook where, it's like a history lesson in that
Mhm.
sense.
Yeah. And you mentioned your grandfather. This is somewhat based on his experience. So did you
Mhm.
grow up hearing about his childhood, or how much did you know about that?
Yeah, so I definitely knew that India played a big part in his upbringing. Of course, he was born there, he grew up there and lived there until he left for college. So all his formative years, and his first language is actually Bengali, and he would even talk on the phone to his brothers in Bengali.
Hmm.
And there were just details of like he loved to cook food. He cooked a lot of Indian food. So it was always like kind of around. Indian culture was around, but I didn't really like hear about like the stories that much until one Thanksgiving when I was in college or so. And we pulled out like all of these memoirs and autobiographies that several of the family members wrote. And they were just so detailed with their life in India. And it was just like this treasure trove of information that would make a perfect story, I thought. So, yeah, there was plenty of firsthand accounts to inform the research part of this novel. So, yeah.
So what was the process like for you then to fictionalize family events? Was that difficult or?
Um, yeah, I think actually it's kind of like a double-edged sword where like I had so much information, but then, you have to pick out what's interesting. I had to kind of put on like an objective lens. Like some things might be interesting to me. Like for
Mhm.
example, we had my grandpa's like reading list in high school, and like that's interesting to me, and I
Yeah.
love reading and I love books, and I was an English major and all that, but someone who doesn't know this family like wouldn't care about that. So that's an example of like where I needed to pick and choose like what would actually serve a story that would be appealing to everyone versus what's just interesting to me. But like I mentioned before, I tried to keep the scope pretty small with the family in one season. I know a lot of people who write novels based on family history, they might be tempted to write a whole saga of, like one generation to the next and what happened year by year by year. But I just wasn't really interested in that. I think I was more interested in like just immersing myself in this world, even for a brief amount of time, and just kind of having those like vivid details like come alive on the page rather than really explore every single like family member and their branch of the family tree, you know. So,
Mhm. And this is a little bit off topic, but at one point the brothers, because there are four, Gene is the youngest, and the oldest is about to go to college
mhm.
shortly, and none of them have been to America. Was that the case for your grandfather? Did he go to college having
Yeah.
never been to America?
Um, you know, I want to say that they may have visited because they had family in America and their parents came from America. And so I want to say that they might have visited briefly, like over school breaks, but they hadn't really lived there,
Yeah.
and you know had to make a life there. And one of the funny details is actually that they worried about how their mother was going to find the spices that they were used to because they only knew the Bengali names of the spices
Right.
rather, and so they had to like figure out like how to say them in English and how to find them in the US. So. Yeah, so yeah, all of the brothers left around college age to go to college in the US. So that's when they finally left India. And some of them went back. Some of them really one of them even worked with a mission again and was very connected in that sense. But for my own grandfather, his memories of his childhood in India were so like precious to him that he actually didn't want to go back because he
Hmm.
knew it would be different and he didn't want to, you know, affect his like relationship and his memories of India in that
Right.
sense.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit more. It is dual points of view with Gene and Arthur. Can you talk a little bit about each of them, what might resonate with readers?
Oh, sure. Well, so I chose to choose these two characters because they're kind of outliers in a sense. Gene is the youngest, and he is, you know, just under a barrage of these like very kind of domineering older brothers who have like a specific like expectation for how they should be. And especially like you can see this in the athletic games that they're all gearing up for that is coming up at the end of the book. And, you know, Gene is not quite as athletic as his older brothers. And he also hasn't like solidified his opinions of the world yet. He's not as experienced as his older brothers, and he's a bit naive. So he's more like questioning of the world. And I thought that was a good way to kind of connect him to Arthur, the servant, who is, you know, the only Indian in the household. And he also, of course, is a different power level than the people that he serves. So they both were able to kind of show, you know, the power and the social hierarchy of this point in time from different perspectives. So and I thought that kind of reflected the larger perspective of Americans in India who are also kind of outsiders as well, even though they have, you know, the power and the influence of being white people in India at the time. They are not actually part of like the British society. They're not allowed in the British social club.
Right.
The family, the Hintons themselves are actually quite poor compared to a lot of British people who were pretty wealthy. So yeah, I think that stories that are about outsiders, I think, have always appealed to me. I think because that's just a more interesting take, in my opinion. Like they look at the status quo and they kind of question it, and you know, they don't fit in and they wonder why. And I just think that's more interesting for the reader to kind of follow their journey of discovery.
You know, when I think about it, kind of everybody in this book, and it's not a huge cast of characters, is an outsider in some ways. There maybe are a few secondary characters who I wouldn't classify, but the obviously Gene and Arthur are the two main protagonists. But even Judge Ellis, in some ways, is an outsider because of his circumstances, and the Hinton family are outsiders. The Jaya, the other Indian woman, is an outsider in many ways. There's a lot of levels of being an outsider in this book, and it just kind of occurred to me as we as Joanne was talking about being an outsider and how those stories kind of appeal to her in terms of writing. But I'm going to contemplate that a little bit more as we go to our next break. When we come back, we'll be talking about writing from dual points of view and if there were any challenges to that process. You're tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with Joanne Howard. Before the break, Joanne was talking about writing from the perspective of outsiders, of being an outsider. Let's go ahead and return now to the conversation with Joanne. Were there any challenges really to writing from two, in some ways similar, but also very disparate points of view?
Yeah, I mean, they are, yeah, exactly what, as you said, there are some disparate parts of it too, where, I think age was one of the big things. I think in my early drafts, one of the feedback points that I got consistently was like it wasn't clear how old Gene was or how old Arthur was. And I think again, I must have an aversion to like exact years because I never like wanted to specify it. But yeah, just kind of like grappling with like their different points in life and how to portray that um authentically, especially since my age is like somewhere in between both of them. So that was a bit tough. But then the other thing too, of course, is that Arthur is, writing outside of my own ethnicity. And of course, that can be a really sensitive topic. But I just tried to read as many works of literature by Indian authors or about Indian characters who might kind of line up with Arthur's identity. And I also had a sensitivity reader who that's a great tool that authors have today. So yeah, there's really kind of no excuse. I think authors can cautiously and respectfully write outside of their ethnicity or their identity, as long as I said, it's respectful and well researched, I think.
Yeah. Speaking of research, obviously you had your grandfather's and his family's memoirs. What other types of research did you then do?
So I went to India in 2018 with my family. Their street actually still exists, the neighborhood, the area, their mission exists. The boarding school that they went to in Missouri, which is a foothill town in the Himalayas, that exists. Went to Howrah train station, which is in the second chapter, I believe. And yeah, I mean, you just have to put yourself in the place and, hear all the sights and sounds. And that was very important to me, of course, because I tried to be very intentional about bringing the sensory details alive in the descriptions. Um, and then also, as I mentioned, like just reading as much literature as I could about this time period. The autobiography of an unknown Indian definitely helped a lot with building Arthur's kind of worldview and his mentality. And then Pather Panchali, which is a classic Bengali novel about a rural family that kind of goes on the road on their own journey of self-discovery and like general life betterment. And I thought those were just like two like very classic and simple but human uh, endeavors that Arthur could relate to.
Mhm.
Yeah. And again, this all started in the environment of my master's degree. So, in that kind of academic environment, like it's expected to, be researching a lot and yeah, just using as many resources as possible.
Sure. One thing
Yeah.
that I'm fascinated about with India, and I have not been there, it's on my list for someday, but is just the variation. You can go 15 miles or maybe a little more, but and the language is different, the food is it's there are many similarities, but there's also some vast differences. So I would
Yeah.
imagine that would be I I would imagine for me I would get a little bogged down and like there's just so much.
No,
I don't want to.
totally. Absolutely. And of course, as I mentioned, as an author writing outside of my identity, I felt like I had to almost like overcompensate for like, gaining enough research to like have the authority to write about this. So I did find myself like, do I like do I need to read like the whole Mahabharata? Like at what point do I need to at what point is enough,
Right.
to enough research, I guess, like do I need to know about all the regions of India, even though my book only takes place in Bengal, so things like that were, things I had to make a decision about for myself. But I think at the end of the day, I just tried to determine like what will serve the book, what does the book need, and just allow myself to move forward without knowing every single detail about it, Indian history, which is a lot, of course. So
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. And then in terms of your characters, especially with Gene and Arthur, but even all of the secondary characters with the family, etc., some of Arthur's acquaintances and friends, do you have a pretty good idea of those characters when you started writing, or did they evolve as you wrote? Did some of them kind of appear as you wrote?
Yeah, actually they did evolve later in the book because again, going back to, did I have the authority to write Indian characters? At first, in the first draft, I really only had Arthur and Jaya as the main Indian characters, and I did kind of hold them at arm's length. Like I didn't develop them as much as the Hinton family because I felt, not confident in writing them properly. But then as I wrote the story, I realized that, Arthur is an extremely important character. He's central,
Mhm.
and so I needed to just give him much more of a developed storyline, and that involved, bringing in more characters. His friend Near, for example, is a great kind of companion to him and helps kind of like explore Arthur's connection to his fellow Indian people. And then the character of Sony, who is Near's cousin, is another character that I added later in the writing process. So yeah, they did come in later, but they're absolutely crucial to the story and strengthen it a lot, definitely.
You never want to give away the ending of a book because we want people to read it, but can you talk a little bit about it's fairly open-ended in some ways. Can you talk a little bit about choosing to do it that way? With of
Yeah,
course, being vague.
yeah,
Sorry
it's
to,
tough. Well, I mean, it's kind of hinted. I'll say that like so the family does leave at the end because that is hinted at in one of the first conversations in the book when the judge comes to dinner for the first time and they talk about, it might be time to leave India. And that is kind of like a theme of the whole book is the sense of leaving or things coming to an end. Um, and there is but as you mentioned, there is kind of an open-ended bit about that. Which I won't spoil, but I wanted to kind of leave or kind of like reflect on the larger political landscape of the British who are going to leave India imminently. And it's still, a decade off, but it's the writing is on the wall. And I think this family like very much reflects that in this book and their journey in this story. This brief amount of time that takes place in the story is about this leaving. And there's the opening scene of the book is also kind of echoed at the end too. The scene of the funeral procession of a father of the family. He has passed away, and the eldest son is leading the funeral procession, and that is echoed at the end of the book in another way. And again, it kind of just all reflects like this patriarchy of the British Empire over India, and the book has something to say about that. So,
all right. Thanks. I know that was it's hard to to talk about
yeah,
without giving
Yeah. No,
spoilers.
but it's a central, theme of the book. So yeah, happy to kind of talk about it a little.
Yeah. So I want to clarify. I misspoke some when I said that the ending was kind of open-ended. I didn't phrase that very well because it wraps things up that need to be wrapped up. It doesn't leave you just like hanging in any way. Things that you have questions about do get answered, things do get wrapped up. I think more of what I meant was that the ending left me unsettled in many ways, and that's not the same thing as open-ended. Just being unsettled about some of the things, some of the ways that stories wrapped up, and kind of wanting more, not because it's badly written, because I personally just maybe wanted things to be different, or I wanted to know more, or just so unsettled would be a better word. And that's on me as the reader. It's not that the ending doesn't conclude anything. Now I'm kind of rambling, but just wanted to sort of clarify that, or maybe I've made it more confusing. But you read the book and you be the judge. And we're going to take another break. When we come back, we will be talking about what readers might take away from the book. You're tuned in to the GSMC Book Review podcast, and I'll be right back. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review podcast and my conversation with Joanne Howard. Before the break, Joanne was talking about the end scene of the book and the ways in which it mirrored the opening scenes of the book. Let's go ahead and return to the conversation with Joanne. Is there anything particular, because this is kind of set in a specific point in history, but is there anything particular that you hope the reader might take away from the story?
I think one of the things that I'm really proud of, and whenever like a friend of mine who has read the book, when they pointed out, it just like makes my heart feel so full that they noticed what I put in there. It's the symbolism of Moti the dog, who is on the cover,
Mm-hmm.
and the dog is she she is kind of a thing that the judge and Arthur both connect with.
Yeah.
The judge kind of wants to own the dog and train the dog and make her his own, whereas Arthur sees her more as a companion, but as a free companion who's free to come and go. And I thought that that was just an interesting way to to kind of symbolize how the British see power, and especially over, the natural world of India. Moti is an animal and, is not a human. So I thought that was kind of an interesting way to explore how the British and Arthur kind of have a different influence over India. And obviously that would make a lot of sense since the British kind of come in with a sense of ownership, whereas Arthur's Indian heritage is much more, I guess like pure and more, unadulterated by this like power, hunger for power, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah. You see it a little bit also reflected in the briefer story with the leopard.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I'm glad you picked up on that too. Yeah, the leopard also represents like the natural world of India, but I think is less influenced by humans, of course. Dogs are man's best friend, whereas the leopard is like a truly wild animal. But again, this leopard is another animal that kind of comes in between the judge and Arthur. So
Yeah.
yeah, thank you for pointing that out.
Um, Obviously there's specific circumstances for writing this with your grandfather's experience, and that drew you to the story, but what else draws you to writing historical fiction?
Oh, it is one of my favorite genres. I read historical fiction quite a bit. I suppose I also, in terms of just this book specifically, I am drawn, as we were just talking about, like the relationship of humans and nature. I think, for some reason, I think that is really well done in history, just because in historical fiction, just because you can explore time periods where there was less human civilization or less human development. So I think you can explore maybe like a deeper or closer connection to nature. I consider myself a nature lover. I love backpacking and landscape photography and hiking, especially here in California. It's absolutely amazing.
Mhm.
So I think that my love of nature hopefully comes through in the book. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Are you working on a new project now?
I'm kind of exploring a new idea for a novel. I think I am trying to find something that's maybe a little closer to home and maybe more aligned with my own experience. Yeah, I think it's been tough though because I this is my first book, and I spent like 6 years at least on it, and the whole time I felt so compelled to tell it. Like I don't know what it was. I just had like such a personal connection, and I could just, picture the world so vividly in my mind. And in a lot of ways it kind of came out very easily, in terms of, just picturing what was in my mind and then getting it out on the page. Sometimes that was a very smooth transition, but I think I'm being very picky and like having high standards almost when it comes to my next project. Like I want to find the thing that you know grasps me the way that this book did. So yeah.
Would,
But eventually I definitely want to write several more books in my life, I hope. So
yeah. Would you ever return to this world in terms of like the characters, maybe later in America or a prequel even? Would you ever do that?
I hadn't really intended on it, but several people who have read the book have mentioned like they would love to see what happens next and how the family, finds its way in America. And I do think that would be an interesting story. So I think maybe I still have a bit of fatigue though with this book, just
Sure.
because
Yeah.
I was so immersed in it for so long
Yeah.
that that thought had never occurred to me. But that is in the back of my mind though. Enough people have mentioned that they would be interested in it. So it's worth thinking about for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, Obviously you were writing this as your thesis, so writing is something that you're interested in and wanting to do, but did you want to write for publication, or did that come out of this process specifically?
Yeah, I did. I think I wanted to write this book specifically no matter what happened, but yeah, the goal was always to have it published. But, I was never like, let me write the story or idea that will be most likely to be published, like what's the most popular right now.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I do think that this time period is not super well represented in recent historical fiction releases. So, I didn't really think that this book was going to be like a super popular topic. And a lot of historical fiction recently, I think, is typically about women characters too,
Mm.
which this book doesn't really follow. It has two main male characters. So I didn't want like commercial success to influence the book. I wanted to write the book that I wanted to write first and foremost. And then if it happened to get published, then I would consider myself very lucky. And I did go the traditional route of finding a literary agent and trying to publish like with one of the big five. And It did get some positive responses from some literary agents, but ultimately I went with the hybrid press, and I'm very happy. The process has been amazing. It's distributed by Simon and Schuster, which is a huge partnership for She Writes Press, and even just like the work of the cover art, I'm so happy with how it came out. I'm amazed. I'm really happy with the way that this book has turned out in all aspects.
You mentioned that a lot of historical fiction tends to be from a woman's perspective, and I think I hadn't really thought about it till you said that, but that would have been a very interesting challenge if you were strictly going by the women in this book, of which there's really only two that are prominent. That you've got Near's cousin, but Mrs. Hinton and Jaya are very complicated in the brief glimpses that we get of them. I think that would have been a very interesting, but maybe difficult
I've
challenge.
talked about this. Yeah, I've talked about this in other conversations about the book, about how, the women do, they aren't the main characters, but they absolutely play a huge important role in shaping the story. And I think that Mrs. Hinton and Jai in particular, I think they kind of contrast quite well in terms of their power dynamics too, where it's kind of interesting because Jaya, the Indian woman who comes to the boarding house, it's revealed that, she has actually quite a bit of agency and freedom in terms of being able to move around and make decisions for herself, whereas Mrs. Hinton is actually kind of tied to like the social expectations of her, even though she is the white woman who you would think would have, much more power. So yeah, absolutely. Like, I think that could have been a very interesting perspective if I had dove deeper into either of those characters and, made one of them one of the main storylines. But yeah, I think I'm not sure why I didn't make one of the main characters a woman. I think it was probably just because in real life it was my grandpa's story and he was one of four brothers. So it was probably that. But I think it would have been quite interesting if, Arthur had been like a female servant instead, and how might that have been different?
Yeah, interesting. I always find it interesting to think about points of view in the books that I read and consider other points of view that might have been included, and so it's interesting to hear authors' perspectives on that and the decisions that they made going into the writing. Mrs. Hinton and Jaya are in a lot of ways very important to the plot and the way things run, even though they aren't main characters, or their point of view isn't represented, but the things that they do and their actions help to move the plot along in many ways. So it would have been interesting to have one of their points of view included, but it would have been a very different book. And so, that's always the trade-off, is you get a very different product. So I don't know. For me, it's just interesting to see the behind the scenes and kind of think about the workings of the decisions that are made in the process of writing a book. We're going to take our final break of this podcast. When we come back, advice from Joanne for aspiring authors. You're tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with Joanne Howard. Before the break, we were talking about Mrs. Hinton and Jaya, two of the female characters who they're technically secondary characters, but very important to the plot and how it unfolds. Let's go ahead and return now to the conclusion of the conversation with Joanne. Do you have any particular advice for maybe someone who has a story that they are thinking they would like to tell?
Yeah, I think from my master's program was where I got the best advice, which is that we had this saying that was like writing a novel is like driving a car at night, where you can only see so far as the headlights, but you can make the whole trip that way. So I often felt like that writing this book. I just was like, never going to finish it. How do people write books? It takes so long. It took me years. But you do eventually get there, and it really is just breaking things down piece by piece. I think what helped me most was that I wrote the scenes that like grasped me the most and excited me the most. Like the first scene that I wrote actually was the leopard scene where the family encounters a leopard in the jungle. And, that's so much more exciting than, maybe some of the early chapters where you kind of have to establish, the house and the little details like that. So, I would say start with those exciting scenes and then kind of connect them. And also accept that your ending and your beginning will probably change. It's very likely that, by the time you get all the way to the end and write your whole book, you might realize that your opening, wasn't as connected as you thought it was to the story or something like that. So, nothing should be set in stone with your book. You should always, be open to changing things if that's what the story needs. So, yeah.
When you take time to read, as opposed to writing, and you're reading just for you, what are your go-to genres and authors?
Oh, I've been reading some nonfiction lately. I am currently reading a biography of a Korean woman, Korean American, who was actually written by She Writes Press or published by She Writes Press. It's called Kinda Korean. I guess I'm just kind of interested in how, humans kind of struggle with their identity, whatever that is, whether it's their racial identity, gender, whatever, and in whatever genre or time period too. Historical fiction, I think, as hopefully my book is a great example. Historical fiction can be, a great genre for that, for characters exploring their identities, but it could be anything, could be a contemporary as well. So yeah, I kind of read all over the place, honestly. I was an English major. So for the longest, well, for 4 years in my undergrad, I was reading basically mostly classics.
Sure.
And I think now I'm a bit burnt out on classics and I'm trying to read a lot more contemporary. So that's what I've been reading too. Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. In terms of internet presence, if you have a website, if you can share that, and then any social media that you're active on.
Yeah, you can find me on joannehowardwrites.com, and my bookstagram is Joanne's Books. So I post any of my upcoming author events, but I also just post, book reviews of what I'm reading. So follow along. Joanne at Joanne's Books.
Okay, thank you. Joanne, is there anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to make sure you highlighted during this time?
I don't know. I think I would love to touch on the fact that I am an indie author, and I think, this is in hybrid published book. And one of the things that's so great about that is that, I am kind of an unknown. I don't have a big platform. I've never written a book before. And I think that that can be very tough when you're trying to go the traditional publishing route. But that can also just close the doors on so many amazing books and amazing authors who do deserve their books to be seen. So I just wanted to just do a little plug for any indie authors or hybrid presses, and just check those out as well. There's some amazing books out there, even if they're not traditionally published. So yeah, thank you for talking about my book. I appreciate
Absolutely. Well, thank you for taking the time out of your day to talk about your book and the writing of it. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks. Thank you again to Joanne for joining me to talk about Sleeping in the Sun. If you are a fan of historical fiction, then you will definitely want to check this out, especially if you are either familiar with this time period and the events that take place in this time and place, then it's something that you'll want to check out. Or if you're not, I know some about this time period. I know some about like I said, this time period and this place, but not much. And it's not that this goes into a lot of those specific details you heard in the interview. That's not really what the book is about, but it gives you a good understanding of maybe some of the people and the thought processes and what was going on from a different perspective, from the perspective of just living in that time period and trying to figure things out, and through Gene's eyes and Arthur's eyes, even a little, through Judge Ellis's eyes. He's not a likable character, but you get a different perspective of what is going on and what other people may have been seeing or perceiving of the circumstances around them. So definitely check this out if you're a fan of historical fiction, or if you're looking for a book to give to someone who is a fan of historical fiction. As Joanne said, this isn't as often represented of a time and place for historical fiction. There's so many. So, we've said this before, that lately it's been a lot of historical fiction set in World War II, in and around World War II. So it's nice to get some different perspectives and different time periods and different places, just to see other perspectives and other views into history. So thank you to Joanne for joining me. Thank you to you, as always, for joining me. It's greatly appreciated. I hope that you will join me next time. We are taking a very different turn when Kimberly McLeod joins me to talk about the ultimate book of would you rather questions. This is 1001 would you rather questions. Those sometimes easy to answer, oh no, I know exactly which one I would rather. Sometimes there's no good answer. You don't want either of the options. Sometimes you think maybe both are good. My husband loves these kinds of questions. These are geared for kids, teens, younger, but I read some of them to my husband, and we had a good time. So I'm looking forward to talking to Kimberly about what goes into writing 1001 would you rather questions. So please join me for next week's episode in the interview with Kimberly. In the meantime, as always, if you're a fan of this podcast, please do like, follow, subscribe. Really does help the algorithm. Something else that really helps the algorithm is to leave a positive review. That helps more than maybe you even know or think about. But if you're so inclined, please do that. It's greatly appreciated. If you're on social media and would like to follow the podcast, you can find it on Facebook, X, Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky. Find the podcast, me by extension, I guess, and let me know any questions, comments, etc., what you're reading, all those good things. Come find me, leave comments. They're appreciated. And I love hearing from you. I hope you're having a great week so far. Whatever's going on in your life, though, my hope is the same, that you find plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go to